Welcome to Worth Coin, and today we are looking at a Washington quarter that proves why you should never judge a coin simply by the denomination stamped on it. Imagine finding an old quarter in a forgotten collection, a family coin jar, or even ordinary pocket change, and discovering that its tiny details tell a completely different story from what you expected. The 1970 Philadelphia Washington quarter is especially interesting because collectors pay close attention to condition, striking quality, varieties, and unusual minting characteristics. While some extraordinary 1970 Washington quarter errors from the era have become famous among specialists. Before we go any further, there is one important reality check. The enormous dollar figures sometimes claimed online for ordinary examples of this coin are not supported by documented auction records. PCGS records a top auction result of $2,160 for a regular 1970 Philadelphia quarter graded MS67+, while NGC's Washington quarter auction records show that exceptional 1970 issues can command dramatically higher prices when they involve a genuinely rare variety or unusual error. So if someone tells you that every 1970p quarter is automatically worth a gigantic fortune, don't believe the headline, because the real treasure hunt is much more fascinating. You have to determine exactly what you have, and that is where this story begins. The 1970 Philadelphia Washington quarter was produced during a fascinating period in American coinage, when the United States Mint was already several years into the transition away from traditional 90% silver circulating quarters. The standard quarter of this era consisted of a copper core surrounded by layers of copper nickel, giving the coin its familiar silvery appearance, while making it fundamentally different from the pre-1965 silver Washington quarters that collectors often associate with the series. PCGS lists the regular 1970 Philadelphia issue as having a mintage of 136,420,000 pieces, with a diameter of 24.30 millimeters and a weight of 5.67 grams. At first glance, those numbers seem to make the coin anything but rare, and that is precisely why this coin can be so deceptive. A large mintage does not automatically mean every surviving example is identical in collectible desirability. Think about what happened after these coins left the mint. Millions entered commerce, passed through cash registers, bounced around in drawers, traveled in pockets, disappeared into vending machines, and suffered decades of contact with other coins. Most examples were never intended to become collectibles. They were created to circulate. That means the real challenge for collectors today is finding examples that escape the normal wear and damage of circulation. This is where condition becomes incredibly important. A common coin in ordinary condition may remain a common coin, but a coin with exceptional preservation can become dramatically more interesting. PCGS records the regular 1970 issue's auction record at $2,160 for an MS67+ example sold by Heritage Auctions in June 2019. That documented result is far more useful than sensational claims because it shows us something important about the hobby. Value comes from rarity, condition, authentication, demand, and provenance, not simply from a dramatic number attached to a date. And there is another reason collectors should pay attention to the 1970 era. The year produced some genuinely fascinating Washington quarter varieties and errors. PCGS catalogs a famous 1970s proof Washington quarter that was struck over a 1900 Barber quarter, an extraordinary minting mistake that demonstrates just how unusual coins from this period can become. Notice the distinction. That famous piece is a 1970s proof, not an ordinary 1970p circulation quarter. This distinction matters enormously when examining your own coin. A collector should never see the year alone and immediately assume a famous error exists. Instead, you want to examine the mint mark, surfaces, lettering, rims, edge, weight, strike, and overall appearance. On the Philadelphia issue, the absence of a mint mark is normal for this period, so the lack of a letter underneath Washington's portrait is not automatically an error. This is one of those details that separates an experienced collector from someone simply chasing internet rumors. The reverse deserves just as much attention. Washington quarters carry a design featuring an eagle and inscriptions that can show subtle differences depending on strike quality and die condition. When examining a potentially valuable example, look carefully for doubling that appears to be part of the die rather than ordinary damage caused after the coin left the mint. Post-mint damage can create flattened, distorted, or seemingly doubled lettering, but genuine doubled die characteristics have a different appearance and should be studied carefully under magnification. The same principle applies to the date. A damaged digit, a scratch crossing the date, or mechanical doubling can sometimes look spectacular to an inexperienced eye, yet it may not represent a major collectible variety. This is why serious collectors compare suspected varieties against known reference photographs and, when appropriate, seek professional attribution. Imagine someone finding one of these quarters in an old box. At first, it looks dull. Maybe the surface has lost some of its original brilliance. Maybe the edges show the scars of circulation. The person nearly drops it into a spending pile. But then they notice something unusual near the lettering. They pick up a magnifying glass. Suddenly, the ordinary quarter becomes a mystery. Is it damage? Is it machine doubling? Is it a die variety? Is the unusual appearance caused by environmental exposure? Or could it represent a legitimate minting anomaly? That moment of uncertainty is exactly what makes coin collecting addictive. You are not merely asking, "How much is this coin worth?" You are asking, "What happened to this coin before it reached me?" Every mark potentially tells a story. Every unusual feature creates another question. Every question creates another reason to investigate. And that investigative process is far more reliable than trusting a viral valuation. There is also an important lesson about the supposed gigantic value figures sometimes attached to coins online. A headline can say that a certain coin is worth tens of millions, but a headline is not an auction record. A genuine auction result requires a documented sale, a known grade or attribution, and a traceable transaction. For the regular 1970 Philadelphia-Washington quarter, the documented PCGS auction record is $2,160, not a multi-million-dollar sale. That doesn't make the coin boring. In fact, it makes the hunt more realistic and more exciting because you now know exactly what you should be searching for: exceptional condition and legitimate varieties rather than an imaginary guaranteed fortune. And if you are watching this because you believe you have a special 1970 quarter, do not clean it. This is one of the most important rules in coin collecting. Cleaning can permanently alter the original surface and may dramatically reduce collector appeal. A bright, shiny appearance does not automatically mean a valuable coin. In many cases, collectors prefer original surfaces because they preserve evidence of how the coin has aged naturally. Instead, handle it carefully by the edges and place it in a safe holder designed for coins. Then compare it with certified examples and established references. If something truly unusual appears, professional authentication may be worthwhile. Another fascinating aspect is the difference between rarity and scarcity. A coin can be difficult to find in a particular grade without being rare in every grade. The 1970 quarter is a perfect example of why collectors talk about condition rarity. Millions were struck, but the number surviving in superb condition is much smaller. PCGS's auction data demonstrates that a very high-grade example can attract substantial attention compared with ordinary circulated pieces. This creates a hierarchy of desirability. The average worn example may simply be a historical piece of American pocket change. A sharply struck, nearly pristine example can become a condition rarity. A confirmed die variety can attract specialists, and an authenticated measurement error can transform the entire conversation. That is the ladder collectors climb when evaluating coins. Now imagine you are searching an old family collection. You find one 1970 quarter after another. Most are worn. One has scratches. Another has dark discoloration. A third has been cleaned. Then, buried underneath them, you discover a piece with unusually sharp details and remarkably clean surfaces. The date is clear. The rims are strong. The lettering is crisp. There is very little evidence of circulation. You start wondering whether this could be one of the better preserved survivors. That is when the excitement begins, but discipline must take over. Do not assume. Investigate. Compare. Measure when appropriate. Check weight and diameter against known specifications. Examine the edge. Look for signs of alteration. And if the coin appears genuinely exceptional, consider certification. Professional. Rating can establish authenticity and condition, which are both critical when selling a potentially important coin. The broader history of the Washington quarter also adds another layer of fascination. The design was introduced in 1932 to commemorate George Washington's 200th birthday, and it continued through major changes in America's monetary history. The 1970 issue sits in a transitional era between the traditional silver coinage that collectors love and the modern clad coinage that became standard for circulation. Holding one today is therefore like holding a small piece of the evolution of American money. It represents a country changing its coinage materials while maintaining familiar designs that Americans had already grown accustomed to seeing. And that is why collectors can become attached to coins that are not necessarily rare in absolute numbers. Historical context gives them character. Condition gives them scarcity. Errors give them mystery. Provenance gives them a story. And certification gives them market confidence. If you have a 1970 quarter at home, this is the moment to slow down and look again. Check the date. Check the surfaces. Check the rims. Check the reverse. Look for unusual doubling. But remember that not every apparent doubling is valuable. Look for signs of a genuine mint-made anomaly rather than damage acquired decades later. And most importantly, don't let an eye-catching internet claim convince you that a normal example is automatically worth an astronomical amount. The real opportunity is learning how to identify the unusual coin hiding among ordinary ones. And here's where our treasure hunt gets even more interesting, because the next coin in this sequence takes us into another era of Washington quarters, and it has its own set of details that can make collectors stop, look twice, and start asking questions. I am not going to spoil that coin's potential story yet, because the important part is not simply the number attached to it. It is the mystery of what makes one example stand apart from thousands of others. So stay with me, because after understanding what to look for in this 1970 quarter, you will have a much sharper eye for the next coin. And remember, the next coin may look completely ordinary when you first see it, which is exactly why collectors examine dates, mint marks, condition, and unusual characteristics instead of judging a coin from across the room. Before we move forward, take one more look at your own collection. Could there be a quarter you have ignored for years simply because it looked common? Could an unusual surface, a strange strike, or an important variety be hiding in plain sight? These are the questions that keep collectors searching long after the video ends. The 1970 Philadelphia Washington quarter teaches us one of the most valuable lessons in numismatics. The denomination is only the beginning of the story. The real story is in the details. And while the regular issue has a documented auction record nowhere near the sensational figures sometimes claimed online, genuinely exceptional examples and major errors from the era demonstrate why careful examination matters. So don't throw away the ordinary-looking quarter just because someone tells you it is common. And don't assume it is a fortune just because a viral post says so. Learn the difference. Study the evidence. Preserve the coin. And if you discover something truly unusual, have it properly evaluated. Because somewhere between an ordinary piece of pocket change and a documented numismatic rarity is the exact moment when a collector realizes they have found something special. And if you think this 1970 quarter has already given us enough surprises, wait until we turn our attention to the next coin in the sequence. Its story moves us forward into a different decade, with different production circumstances, different collecting interests, and another opportunity to ask the question every treasure hunter loves. Could this seemingly ordinary quarter actually be something much more unusual? Keep watching, because that next discovery is where our search continues, and you definitely do not want to miss the details that could separate an ordinary coin from a collector-worthy one. Next, 1989 P. Washington quarter. And if you thought the previous coin was a reminder that ordinary-looking pocket change deserves a second look, this one takes that lesson into a completely different chapter of American coinage. Imagine finding a quarter from the late 1980s tucked inside an old collection, a forgotten jar, or a drawer that has not been opened in decades. At first, you might see nothing remarkable at all. But what if the difference between an ordinary example and a highly desirable collector piece comes down to details so small that you could miss them without magnification? The 1989 P. Washington quarter is a fascinating coin because its huge production numbers make truly exceptional examples much more interesting, while unusual errors and varieties can turn an otherwise familiar piece of pocket change into a serious numismatic mystery. And before we reveal what makes collectors examine these coins so carefully, remember something important from our previous discussion. Enormous values frequently circulated online are not the same thing as documented auction records. So the real treasure is discovering exactly what makes a particular coin unusual. The 1989 P. Washington quarter was struck at the Philadelphia Mint during the final years of the original Washington quarter design before the historic redesign that would eventually arrive decades later. According to PCGS, Philadelphia produced hundreds of millions of Washington quarters that year, meaning this is certainly not a coin that is automatically rare simply because of its date. But rarity in coin collecting is rarely that simple. A coin can be common overall yet scarce in exceptional condition, scarce with a particular die characteristic, or extremely unusual when a genuine mint error is involved. That is where your eyes need to become your most valuable collecting tool. Start with the basics. Examine the obverse portrait of George Washington. Look at the date. Check the lettering. Inspect the rim around the entire circumference. Then turn the coin over and study the reverse carefully. You are looking for anything that appears different from a normal example. But there is an important distinction between something that happened at the mint and something that happened after the coin entered circulation. A scratch is not automatically an error. A dent is not automatically an error. A flattened letter is not automatically a variety. A shiny surface is not automatically proof of exceptional condition. The challenge is identifying characteristics that can be traced to the minting process itself. One of the most exciting possibilities collectors investigate with coins from this era is doubled die characteristics. Genuine doubled dies occur when a die receives misaligned impressions during its creation, potentially leaving distinctive doubling on certain design elements. But mechanical doubling can create appearances that fool inexperienced collectors. The difference can be subtle, and that is why serious collectors compare suspected examples with established references rather than relying on a quick glance. If you find apparent doubling, examine exactly where it occurs, how it is shaped, and whether it matches known characteristics. Do not immediately assume that every doubled-looking letter is a rare discovery. Instead, treat it as evidence that deserves investigation. Now think about the life of a typical 1989 P quarter. It began as a blank planchet, entered the production process, was struck under enormous pressure, inspected, counted, bagged, transported, and eventually released into the economy. From there, it could have traveled through countless hands. It might have been used at a gas station, dropped into a vending machine, placed in a cash drawer, or carried around in a pocket with keys and other coins. Every one of those events could leave a mark. That is why finding an unusually well-preserved example today can be much more interesting than simply finding an old quarter. The passage of time does not automatically create rarity, but it can reduce the number of high-quality survivors available to collectors. Condition, therefore, becomes a major factor. A heavily circulated example with scratches, contact marks, and worn details is generally far less desirable than a sharply struck coin with strong luster and minimal contact damage. For a common date coin, condition can become the entire story. A collector who searches rolls, bags, estate collections, and old accumulations is not necessarily hoping to find an ancient coin. Sometimes the goal is simply to locate an unusually pristine survivor of a modern production run. And this is where the hunt becomes surprisingly addictive. Imagine opening a bankroll and seeing a row of ordinary quarters. One after another, they look the same. Then suddenly one coin catches the light differently. The portrait appears unusually sharp. The fields are remarkably clean. The rims look strong. There are fewer marks than expected for a coin that spent decades in circulation. You separate it from the others. You inspect it again. Then again. You begin wondering whether you have found a condition rarity. That moment is one of the great pleasures of coin collecting. You are not merely searching for money. You are searching for an outlier. A coin that escaped the normal journey of wear and damage. A coin that survived in a way that most of its brothers and sisters did not. And sometimes the difference can be dramatic when the coin is professionally graded. Certification gives collectors an independent assessment of authenticity and condition, and high-grade examples can attract attention precisely because so few coins survive at that level. This is one reason you should never automatically discard a later-date quarter from your collection simply because you have seen many examples of the same date. Quantity does not tell the entire story. Quality matters. Variety matters. Error status matters. Provenance can matter. Market demand matters. And above all, documentation matters. If you have heard people online claim that a certain 1989 P quarter is worth an astronomical amount, approach those claims carefully. Ask the most important question in numismatics. Where is the documented sale? A real auction record should be traceable to a recognized auction or grading database. Without evidence, a sensational number is simply a claim. This distinction is especially important because online coin content can mix genuine rarities with exaggerated valuations. A dramatic headline may attract attention, but a serious collector wants facts. That doesn't make the hunt less exciting. In fact, it makes it more exciting because now you know what you're actually searching for. You're looking for the legitimate anomaly. You're looking for the coin with a recognizable, verifiable characteristic. You're looking for the example that stands apart from the ordinary population. Consider also the possibility of planchet errors. Washington quarters can occasionally exhibit unusual characteristics when the wrong planchet or an abnormal planchet enters the striking process. Such pieces can be fascinating because they reveal something about the production environment at the mint. But again, authenticity is crucial. A coin that appears unusually thin, oddly colored, or strangely shaped may have been damaged after leaving the mint. The edge can provide important clues. Compare its thickness and appearance with a normal quarter. Look for evidence of alteration, filing, plating, squeezing, or environmental damage. Measure weight with an accurate scale if you suspect something unusual, but remember that small differences can result from normal tolerances, wear, dirt, or measurement equipment. A serious potential error deserves professional examination rather than a guess. Another area collectors watch is off-center striking. During the striking process, a blank can occasionally shift position, producing a design that is noticeably displaced from the center. Dramatic off-center errors can be highly collectible, particularly when enough of the design remains visible to identify the coin and the error clearly originated at the mint. But the important word is dramatic. A tiny amount of apparent displacement does not necessarily create a major rarity. As with double dies and planchet errors, attribution is everything. This is why experienced collectors often photograph a suspected error beside a normal example. Side-by-side comparison can reveal differences that are difficult to recognize when looking at a single coin. It also helps prevent your eyes from exaggerating a normal feature simply because you're hoping it is rare. And that psychological element is something every collector should understand. The moment you think you have discovered a fortune, your brain starts looking for evidence that supports the idea. The best collectors do the opposite. They try to disprove their own discovery. They ask, could this simply be damage? Could this be machine doubling? Could the discoloration come from the environment? Is the weight actually outside normal tolerance? Does a recognized reference show this feature? That skeptical approach is what turns a casual search into serious numismatics. Now imagine an old family collection containing several 1989 P quarters. One has been cleaned. Another is badly scratched. Another has dark toning. Another has obvious circulation wear. But one remains almost untouched. Its surfaces are bright, its details are sharp, and its overall appearance is remarkably clean. That coin may deserve special attention. It might not be an enormous rarity, but it could be a superior example. If you submit it for professional grading and it achieves an unusually high grade, the coin can become much more interesting to collectors who specialize in condition rarities. This is why coin collecting is not simply about age. Some collectors assume that older automatically means more valuable, but that is not how the market works. A relatively modern coin can be highly desirable if it has an extraordinary error, a scarce variety, or exceptional preservation. Meanwhile, a centuries-old coin can sometimes be surprisingly affordable if large numbers survive and demand is limited. The story is always in the details. The 1989 P quarter also represents an interesting point in the history of American circulating coinage. By this period, the copper-nickel-clad Washington quarter had become completely familiar to the public. The traditional silver era was long gone for regular circulation issues, and Americans were accustomed to receiving clad quarters as everyday money. Yet decades later, collectors began paying closer attention to these coins as part of the broader history of United States coinage. What once seemed ordinary can become historically interesting simply because time changes perspective. The same principle applies to today's pocket change. A coin that looks completely unremarkable today may become more interesting decades from now if it has a distinctive variety or unusual production characteristic. That is why collectors keep searching. You never know what was overlooked. And there is another important lesson here. Never clean a suspected valuable coin. Cleaning can leave hairlines, unnatural surfaces, or other evidence that permanently affects collector appeal. If you discover a coin that appears unusually rare, preserve it exactly as you found it. Handle it by the edges, avoid rubbing the surfaces, and store it in an appropriate holder. If you think it may be a major error or rare variety, seek an opinion from a qualified numismatic professional or a respected grading service. That small step can prevent an expensive mistake. So, what should you do if you have a 1989p quarter right now? First, identify it correctly. Second, inspect both sides under good lighting. Third, check the edge. Fourth, look for unusual doubling or other mint-made characteristics. Fifth, compare it against known examples. Sixth, evaluate the condition honestly. And finally, if the coin appears genuinely exceptional, consider professional authentication. Don't let a random internet valuation determine your expectations. Let the evidence determine the story. And this is exactly why I want you to keep watching beyond this coin. Because the next part of our journey is not simply about finding another quarter. It is about understanding how collectors separate ordinary pieces from the examples that create excitement in the market. The next coin in this sequence brings another opportunity to examine the tiny details that most people ignore. And if you have been following along with your own collection, this is the perfect time to put these lessons into practice. Look through your jars. Check those old rolls. Examine the coins inherited from family. You might not find an extraordinary rarity, but you may discover something that deserves a closer look. And remember, the most valuable discovery is not always the coin with the biggest number attached to it. Sometimes the real treasure is learning how to recognize a legitimate rarity. So before you move on, take another look at the 1989p quarter. Look at the portrait. Look at the date. Look at the lettering. Study the rim. Turn it over. Examine the reverse. Ask yourself whether every unusual feature can be explained by normal circulation or post-mint damage. If one feature still seems impossible to explain, that's when your investigation gets interesting. Because that is the moment a coin stops being just another piece of change and becomes a question waiting to be answered. And if this coin has taught us anything, it is that rarity hides in details, not headlines. A coin can pass through thousands of hands without anyone realizing that something about it deserves closer attention. It can sit quietly in a collection for years. It can be ignored because its date is not ancient, its design is familiar, and its denomination is ordinary. Then one careful collector takes a second look. The magnifying glass comes out. The comparison begins. The evidence starts to build. And suddenly, the coin has a story. That is the magic of numismatics. You don't need to be born with a treasure chest. You need patience, curiosity, and the willingness to look where everyone else stopped looking. So keep your eyes open, keep your coins safe, and never let an ordinary appearance convince you that there is nothing worth investigating. Because somewhere out there, another quarter is waiting to be examined, and the next chapter of our search could reveal exactly why experienced collectors never stop checking their change.